So the first thing is that a lot of people who talk about the terms of modernism and postmodernism in the domain of art, you have to be able to define those terms. You have to be able to distinguish them in order to know what you're talking about. So I've often noticed that because there's kind of a trope or a trend on YouTube, for example, at the moment, of people publishing videos against postmodern art, but they often get it wrong. They often will hold up examples of art that is in fact modernist, and say that this is a form of postmodern art. So you have to sort of understand what these terms mean. So fundamentally, I would say that modernism in art is really an outgrowth of romanticism. It's sort of like late stage romanticism. And what it is really, because romanticism is very interesting. What it really does is it puts the individual subjective impulse of the artist to the fore. This is the most important dimension, right? It's my particular individual experience as I've lived it myself and my own subjectivity, and sometimes pushing that rather far. And so romanticism plus the Industrial Revolution gives you modernism, really, in the artistic domain. So what I mean by that is with the Industrial Revolution, you have this sudden, dramatic increase in living standards, and also in the ability to produce things, and also to produce a much wider range of things, much more quickly and at arguably a higher level of quality than was possible previously, or that at least wasn't possible in a strictly artisanal sense. So when you have machine production, you can create more things, and you can create them cheaper than you can if you have to actually sit there by hand creating them. And that had an incalculable influence on music as well. So things like the invention of the phonograph, the record, the ability to record sound, this had an enormous influence. And so suddenly it became possible to capture recordings forever, and to have a much broader range of music at your disposal. So what that meant was you weren't restricted to the sort of narrow range of music that was being produced in your particular country or your particular region, but you could, at least theoretically, listen to music from all over the world with equal ease, provided you had a record player and some access to recordings. So that actually turns out to be a very significant thing. So I would say that one of the defining ideas of modernism, the defining ethos of modernism, is the idea of progress, fundamentally. And so it's the idea that tomorrow is better than today, right? There's some further point that we haven't yet reached that we can attain if we are willing to go farther in our artistic practice. So with a lot of artistic modernism, what you see is a sort of attempt to go further, to go beyond what's already been done. It might be technically, it might be expressively, it might be in the sense of trying to broaden the range of what's already been done in art by saying, okay, this domain here that previously was thought to be off limits for artists, I'm going to explore that domain and see what's in it. And maybe there's something in it that's valuable and useful, and we'll find out. And so modernism has this idea of progress, of gradually opening up the range of what art can do, and also of increasing sophistication and complexity. So, and you can see that very clearly. I mentioned James Joyce earlier. You can see that very clearly if you look at the overall progression of his art from his very beginnings to works like Dubliners, for example, which is a remarkable book, but it's fairly straightforwardly narrative, through to works like Ulysses, which is already getting to be very complicated, and then to Finnegan's Wake, his final novel, which is extraordinarily complex. It's so complex that it took literary scholars decades to sort of figure out everything that was going on in it. So there's very clearly a progression in terms of, I want to make the art more and more complex, and I want it to be able to do more and more things, and I want it to get more technically advanced, so that each new work of art is a progression beyond what I did previously. Okay, so that's a fundamentally modernist idea. So I don't know that you really see that in the same degree in classical art, where it's more about perfection, it's more about achieving formal balance, about symmetry, about ideals of beauty and grace and this sort of thing. Modernism is a bit of a different story, and you can't really understand modernism without understanding that it's tightly connected to this idea of the Industrial Revolution, of increasing living standards, of increasing the ability of the average person to have a higher standard of living. I think these two things are really connected. So okay, so we've dealt with modernism a little bit. That's a very cursory definition, but that's the best I can do in the time I have. So what about postmodernism in the artistic domain? Well, that's not terribly easy to define, but I suppose what I would say is that at a certain point, this idea, the belief in progress, right? The belief that you can keep on making art that's more and more complicated, that's more and more, that goes farther and farther. At a certain point, it starts to sort of turn around on itself, because you could probably argue that there's really only so far you can go until you've just completely violated all the possible rules of the art that you're engaging with. And then there's no rules left to break. There's no further domain left to explore, because you've sort of opened the doors so wide that anything is admissible within the range of your art. So then what do you do? So there's a couple of ways that you can react to that. So one way is you could say, well, here are the things that have been done so far, but there are still areas left to explore, and there are areas that could perhaps be explored with more depth or more subtlety, or there are maybe specific forms of art or types of emotional experience that haven't been delved into maybe quite as far. And you could try doing that. Or you could say, well, all the rules have been broken, everything's permitted, nothing is forbidden, so therefore everything goes and everything is equal. So there's no longer any particular hierarchy in the values of what constitutes a work of art. So you can do anything and call it a work of art. And then the other corollary to that, I suppose, is that it creates a somewhat of a distancing effect. Because one feature of postmodern literature, for example, is the idea of a kind of ironic removal. It's like there's a kind of distance to it. So these sorts of writers no longer believe really in the idea that a work of art can be a directly transforming experience. In other words, that you can have some kind of a one-to-one relationship with that work itself, and that it will affect you strongly, and that process will be somehow placed within a sort of progressive vision of history. In postmodernism, you have this, in postmodern art anyway, you have this idea that the cultural products of the past are all there for the taking, and you can sort of steal whatever you want from them and combine them in any order that you want to. And so you no longer have to care about the particular reasons for why a particular form of art came into being in the first place, or what it might have meant when it was created. You can just sort of take it as an object, as though you found, a broken spear over here, and then you found a Roman column over there, and you just sort of put them together, and you don't worry about where they come from. You just sort of think of them as objects, and you try to put them together into something else. So it's very, very difficult, though, again, for me to cite examples of postmodern music, because I've thought about this question. There is actually a book, a scholarly book that was published called Post-Modern Music, which I bought and I read and I tried to understand it. But what they did was they looked at an extremely wide range of different types of music by different types of composers with wildly different attitudes, and brought them under the same title. And in the preface to the book, they say, the first thing they say actually in the introduction was, it's impossible to define postmodernism in music. And then they go on to write a whole book about what that is. So I found that actually very confusing. And so I'm still not actually entirely sure how I would define it. Although I suppose you could say, again, that some form of distance, of irony, of leveling of hierarchies, perhaps, of saying that everything is potentially suitable for a work of art, that there's no value judgments that are possible in terms of what you're going to put in and what you're going to leave out, etc. Perhaps that would be reflective of a postmodern attitude, but that's as closest as I can come to a definition.